After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday, or centuries before? The feet, mechanical, go round a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment, like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go.
Welcome to Fresh Perspectives in Poetry. I'm M.B. McClatchy. Our focus in this and subsequent sessions is why the masters matter. For poets and poetry lovers, I invite you to join me on a journey of listening to some of the most beautiful poems ever produced by the most notable poets in the world. And for poets like myself who want their poems to sing, in this video, we'll learn 3 tips, never before produced, by the masters on how to tap the poet within and unleash our creative potential. After great pain, Emily Dickinson says, a formal feeling comes. But what is this formal feeling that Dickinson refers to? It is the hard work of crafting poems. It is the question, how do I transfer emotions and experiences in my life to the poem on the page? What is the link between the life I'm living and the life of the poem? As poet and critic Rebecca Hazelton notes, unlike other arts, writers often associate poetry with feeling, but not technique. The majority of us need only glimpse at the image on the right to recognize it as Picasso, a portrait of the artist's wife, Olga. But the image on the left, also Picasso. The difference? On the left, Picasso the apprentice is practicing the tools and techniques of his field: light, color, geometry, and perspective. The portrait on the right? This is the poet we want to be. Picasso the master of his own canvas, and yet employing the same techniques that he learned as an apprentice. So what can we learn from the masters? Tip number 1, how to beat writer's block. The poet Robert Frost rightly reminds us that, quote, a poem begins with a lump in the throat, a homesickness or a love sickness. It is a reaching out toward expression, an effort to find fulfillment. But then what? How do we turn that lump in the throat into a poem on the page? As most poets know, writer's block is not how do I fill the blank page, it is how do I find a clearing through an already cluttered page, a forest of responsibilities, family and work issues that crowd us out of our writing space. How do I find a clearing through this confusing forest of competing obligations in my life so that I can find the poem that I want to write? The answer from the most notable poets: import a poetic form or create your own formal constraints. Formal constraints can provide us with a path, a compass, for finding the poem we want to write. By introducing formal requirements, I shift my focus away from the competing requirements in my life and back to the crafting of my poem. For example, I tell myself, I will only write 3 stanzas with 3 lines each, and line 1 and 3 will rhyme. In effect, these formal requirements relieve me of the anxiety of not knowing how to start my poem, and they make disappear the competing requirements that had cluttered my page. For an example of this, listen to the famous poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in which form does not restrain or muzzle the passion of the poet, it actually unleashes it.
How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use, in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose, with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
Per the requirements of the sonnet form, Browning woos her lover in an unadorned manner. Her speaking voice employs a tenor and a rhythm that rings naturally in the English language. This rhythm is called iambic pentameter, and it is the expected beat for the sonnet. 5 metrical feet, each consisting of one unstressed syllable followed by one stressed syllable. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight. This is the speaking voice that Shakespeare gave to the love-struck Juliet and other performers in his plays, and it is the pace and tenor that he later assigned to the speakers in his own sonnets. Because this rhythm is produced so naturally by speakers in the English language, listeners do not notice the production. Instead, we hear what authentic love sounds like, and we find ourselves listening in on one of the most intimate confessions of passion ever produced. In addition, the poet has produced the sonnet's required 14 lines within which she can explore her dedication to her lover. Browning literally counts the ways for an entire 12 lines. How do I love thee, she asks in her opening line. Let me count the ways. And lastly, per the requirement of the sonnet, the poet ultimately makes a turn in her thinking, a kind of awakening that follows her long reflection on love. This turn, this awakening, is known as the volta, which means to turn, and it usually comes earlier in the poem, around line 8. But Browning knows what the most notable poets writing in form know. We make forms and we break them. We are not servants to the master. We are only apprentices seeking to forge our own masterworks. Listen to how the poet Wordsworth explains this in his sonnet, in which he is writing about the sonnet. In truth, the prison into which we doom ourselves no prison is, and hence for me, in sundry moods, 'twas pastime to be bound within the sonnet's scanty plot of ground. 'Twas pastime to be bound, Wordsworth proclaims, within the sonnet's plot of ground. That plot of ground that Wordsworth says the sonnet provides him, that plot with boundaries, is a playground. His shift from seeing the sonnet as prison and then playground is wonderful. And it is good guidance for those of us who might be shy about experimenting with poetic forms. The renowned formalist poet Annie Finch understands Wordsworth well. Listen to what she has to say about how form liberates us. Etymology of the word paradise is simply, she says, a walled enclosure. Paradise and walled enclosures. Tip number 2, how to unleash our creative selves. It is often assumed that writing in poetic forms restricts the poet's freedom of thought, freedom of movement. But we might ask ourselves, is it the poetic form that is restricting free thought, or are other forces imposing themselves on our thinking? We often begin crafting our poems with all kinds of directives that have little to do with the poem itself. Censors closing in around us as we begin to write. Our friends, our potential readers, our political allies, all telling us what we can and cannot say in our poem. But listen to Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney on who our muses should be when we write poems and who we should tune our ears to when we are crafting.
So I think the difference in a poem or a work of literary art, or shall we say, story novel, is that it isn't for the moment utilitarian, communication. It is some kind of housing of a moment, a snapshot of consciousness that can be looked upon by other persons, people. Yeah. I always like to make a play on two words which sound the same. There's H-E-A-R-D, heard, and there's H-E-R-D, heard. And I think that in writing poetry, especially in times of crisis, political crisis, you've got to be beware of H-E-R-D feelings as opposed to individual H-E-A-R-D. The writer is there to be H-E-A-R-D, singularly, not to be part of the tribe. Although, at moments of crisis, this is a very fine and important distinction, actually. And it's one that in the United States, I noticed in the 60s and 70s when I was here. During the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, we had a very strong sense of the Afro-American, the black civil rights movement here. And I had very strong sympathy with the black American poets here, whose first person singular, I, was under pressure always to become first person plural, we. And so that's always a question that arises, your relationship to your group, whether you should be standing off from them, or being their conscience, as James Joyce was saying, or being their voice. There are different requirements at different times.
And in his famous poem, Digging, Heaney lays out the same instructions for us. Poetry is digging, going to the interior. It is not speech-making.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf. Digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to fellow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. Poetry, Heaney reminds us, goes to the interior, the layers beneath. And while we can certainly produce political poems, Heaney is a master at it. We must remember the distinction between the tools of poetry and the tools of great speeches. In other words, what Heaney and other notable poets remind us of is the difference between poetry and political speech, the difference between metaphor and megaphone. Is this a sonnet I have written, or is it simply a sounding off? Is this a poem, an artifact with the attributes of artifacts, or is it simply political speech? Still, there are other directives challenging the poet, preventing us from plumbing that interior and unleashing our creative spirit. There is the poet's own ego telling us we must write something important, something worth adding to the new canon. Listen to world-renowned Irish poet Paul Muldoon. What is Muldoon's advice for how to dismiss the ego from our poetry? Forget about yourself.
So, it's what I'd say to them is, forget about yourself, as they say. Get over yourself, and remember that the greatest poems, I think, come from a place that no one can quite account for. There's always a mysterious aspect about where they came from. That includes that essay you wrote when you were 15, when you wonder now who wrote that. So one has to develop ways of, insofar as we can, of being able to get to that place.
There's a wonderful concept in Buddhism that formalist poets know well. Fetter the form, and you unfetter the unconscious. Create formal constraints in your crafting of your poem, a required line number or a required rhyme or rhythm, for example, and you unleash the unconscious. You unleash true and uncensored thoughts into your poem. How can this be? In answering to the requirements of rhythm or rhyme, the poet ceases to answer to the censoring forces outside the poem. And so, to unfetter the unconscious is to answer to the poetic form instead of answering to these censors or to these external directives. The lesson here, the process of crafting a poem becomes a discovery rather than a predetermined goal. The formalist poet Annie Finch knows about this discovery well. As Finch shows us, the chant can be one of the most enjoyable and most inward-looking poems to produce. As a poetic form, it is as old as poetry itself, deriving from spiritual and liturgical settings. Characterized by repetition of sounds, phrases, or whole lines, the chant gains its momentum from a trance-inducing labyrinth-like design. Listen to this well-known liturgical hymn for its repetition of phrases that drive the chant and become the very pulse of the performance. Te Deum laudamus, Te Dominum confiterum, Te eternum Patrem omnis terra veneratur, tibi omnes angeli, tibi celi et universe potestates, tibi cherubim et seraphim, incessabili voce proclamant, Sanctus, Sanctus. And now enjoy Annie Finch's adaptation of the chant for her summer solstice chant.
The sun, rich and open, stretches and pours on the bloom of our work. In the center of the new flowers, a darker wing of flower points you like a fire. Point your fire like a flower.
And finally, tip number 3, we make forms to break forms. It is commonly thought that when a poet writes in poetic forms, he becomes a servant to a master, and that his ability to innovate has been inhibited. But who better than the poet Pablo Neruda to remind us of the play and pleasure in writing in inherited forms? Listen to his ode.
Maru Murray brought me a pair of socks which she knitted herself with her sheep herder's hands, 2 socks as soft as rabbits. I slipped my feet into them as though into 2 cases knitted with threads of twilight and goatskin. Violent socks. My feet were 2 fish made of wool, 2 long sharks, sea blue, shot through by 1 golden thread, 2 immense blackbirds, 2 cannons. My feet were honoured in this way by these heavenly socks. They were so handsome. For the first time, my feet seemed to me unacceptable, like 2 decrepit firemen unworthy of that woven fire, of those glowing socks. Nevertheless, I resisted the sharp temptation to save them somewhere, as schoolboys keep fireflies, as learned men collect sacred texts. I resisted the mad impulse to put them into a golden cage and each day give them birdseed and pieces of pink melon. Like explorers in the jungle, who hand over the very rare green deer to the spit and eat it with remorse, I stretched out my feet and pulled on the magnificent socks, and then my shoes. The moral of my ode is this: beauty is twice beauty, and what is good is doubly good when it is a matter of 2 socks made of wool in winter.
Neruda is known for his expansive collection of odes, in which he celebrates the most ordinary elements of life in such poems as Ode to My Suit or Ode to My Socks. Historically, however, the ode originates thousands of years ago in ancient Greece as a poem for praise and celebration of high-standing figures or ideas. It has a strict construction: the strophe, antistrophe, and the epode, 3 different directions in thinking that the speaker usually walks in 3 different stanzas. The ode can be produced in meter or free verse, but its main goal is it should feel like a high occasion. It should feel like ceremony. In Neruda's case, the ceremony is his socks. And so we see again, form does not mean formula. We make forms to break forms. Neruda's poems are a great example of how we can enter a tradition and forge our own new tradition. In the words of the great poet William Blake, I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's. We make forms to break forms. So what have we learned? We've learned how to make a sonnet, an ode, and a chant. We've learned that form does not mean formula. We've learned that poetic forms can replace confusion with compass. Formal constraints can unleash our most creative potential. And finally, we've learned from the masters so we can master our own poetic voice. And lastly, a challenge, if you want it. Write your own ode. Here are some suggestions. Pick an ordinary item in your life: a coffee cup, a wine glass, a favorite sweater. Give your subject praise or thanks. Speak directly to the subject. Limit your poem to 8 lines. For a higher challenge, add rhyme. I hope you enjoyed this. After this video premiere, please join me for discussion in the comments below. I'm M.B. McClatchy.